They thought they had found a lost hiker frozen on the mountain, but within minutes it became clear they were staring at the oldest murder victim ever discovered, a man whose final breath had been trapped in ice for more than 5,000 years, preserved so perfectly that his death looked freshly delivered by the wind. The story begins in 1991, when two hikers crossing a narrow alpine ridge spotted a human body lying face down in the ice. The left arm stretched stiffly ahead as if reaching for something that never came. The other twisted beneath him in a way no recent accident could explain, and even at a distance the leathery dark skin clinging to the ice suggested not days or weeks but centuries of stillness. They called for help, believing they had stumbled upon a tragic mountaineering death, unaware that the man at their feet had lived and died before the pyramids were built, before Rome existed, before written history had drawn its first shaky line. When the authorities arrived and attempted to pry the body free by pulling on the frozen arm, no one yet understood that they were tugging at a crime scene more ancient than any civilization we know, and only when someone noticed the strange shoes woven from grass and hide, followed by the polished copper axe lying beside him, did the entire alpine valley seem to shift, revealing that this was not a modern casualty, but a perfectly preserved man from the Copper Age, whose final moments were still imprinted on the ice. And that was the moment the world's oldest true crime mystery opened itself for investigation. A man murdered on a mountain, left to freeze exactly as he fell, carrying with him the clues that would survive 5 millennia and a glacier's unbroken silence. When researchers finally examined the body more closely, they realized they were looking at something that simply should not have survived the passage of time, because the ice had not just frozen the man but had sealed him inside a natural vault where no animals could reach him, no soil could decay him, and no air could carry away even the smallest trace of his final hours, preserving him with a level of detail that felt almost intrusive, as if time itself had paused over his corpse and refused to move forward. His skin, drawn tight and darkened into a weatherproof hide, still clung to muscle and bone with unnerving precision, the fine lines of age etched around his eyes and mouth, the wrinkles of his hands preserved as if he had only closed his fingers moments before collapsing. Even his hair remained in place, stiff and stubborn, carrying the faint pattern of a style worn thousands of years before anyone imagined the concept of history. His nails, his intestines, the contents of his stomach, all intact, all waiting to be read like clues scattered through a frozen diary that nature had locked away for millennia. What truly stunned the scientific teams were the tattoos, more than 60 of them, simple lines and crosses placed along joints, the spine, the ankles and wrists, not decorative symbols but marks that seemed intentional, therapeutic, perhaps the earliest surviving attempt at acupuncture, suggesting that this man lived with chronic pain and had found his own way to treat it long before medicine had a name for such things. Each mark was perfectly preserved, each line still visible beneath the translucent stretch of mummified skin, offering a glimpse into a life that had endured far more hardship than any modern existence. Then came the clothing, a chaotic but ingenious assembly of prehistoric survival gear that revealed not only the harshness of his environment, but the skill with which he had learned to adapt to it. A coat stitched from goat hide, leggings crafted from sheep leather, a hat made of brown bear fur that implied remarkable courage or desperation, and shoes so cleverly built, stuffed with grass and lined with deer skin, that modern mountaineers later admitted they would have survived alpine winters with surprising efficiency. Even the backpack frame, a wooden structure bound with leather straps, carried traces of tools and supplies that painted Ötzi as a resourceful traveler who trusted neither the weather nor the unpredictable world around him. Everything he carried suggested experience, resilience, and preparation. He was equipped for long journeys and harsh conditions, armed not only with knowledge, but with tools that represented wealth and skill in his time. And yet, despite all this preparedness, despite the careful construction of his gear and the hard-earned wisdom carved into his worn hands, He had died alone on a ridge high above the world, struck down before he could finish his last unfinished task, left to freeze in the exact posture of his final failing breath. When investigators catalogued the belongings scattered around his frozen body, they realized almost immediately that Ötzi had not been an ordinary wanderer, but a man who traveled with the wary caution of someone who had learned to mistrust both nature and other humans, because his equipment formed a complete survival kit, one that spoke quietly but unmistakably of danger, preparedness, and a life lived on the edge of conflict. The most striking object was the copper axe, a tool so valuable in his era that owning it would have set him apart instantly, not simply as a man of means, but as someone with status, connections, and likely a position of authority within his community. The blade, made from nearly pure copper and polished by careful hands, was mounted on a curved U-handle with a level of craftsmanship that suggested both pride and purpose, the kind of object you did not carry unless you wanted to be seen, respected, or feared. In a time when most tools were stone, this axe would have shone like a symbol, marking him not just as a traveller but as someone important and someone worth targeting. Beside it lay his bow, unfinished and telling its own silent story, carved from yew wood and nearly as tall as the man himself. It showed signs of recent work, fibres peeled back, the curve still not set, as if he had begun repairing or building it in haste, perhaps after breaking a previous one during a struggle, or perhaps because he believed another confrontation was coming. The arrows found with him were a strange combination of the prepared and the incomplete, some fully formed, fletched with precision, others only half-shaved shafts, and one fletched incorrectly, angled in a way that would have sent it spiraling off target, a detail that suggested he had rushed through his work or had been forced to abandon it suddenly, interrupted by something far more urgent than craftsmanship. Then there was the knife, a small flint blade set in a wooden handle, simple and practical yet bearing microscopic traces of someone else's blood, as if it had been used moments before his death in a tense, close encounter where survival had depended on desperate movements and raw instinct. This was not ceremonial blood, not residue from an old hunt. It was fresh at the time he died, a clue modern forensics would eventually read as a grim whisper, pointing toward conflict with multiple individuals. In his pouch, investigators found a fire-starting kit, flint, pyrite, and pieces of tinder fungus, evidence that he knew survival depended on heat and flame in the alpine cold, carrying tools that allowed him to ignite fire even in harsh weather. And within another small container they discovered birch polypore fungus, an ancient medicinal substance with antibacterial and antiparasitic properties, suggesting that Ötzi suffered from lingering ailments or infections and treated himself with whatever remedies the Copper Age offered. Every item around him, the axe, the arrows, the bow, the knife, the medicinal fungi, the carefully bound backpack frame, painted a portrait not of a peaceful traveller wandering aimlessly, but of a man who expected danger as surely as he expected cold winds, someone who had reason to distrust the world around him, and who lived in a time where violence was sudden, personal, and often fatal. And yet, despite being armed, prepared, and knowledgeable, he had been overtaken, forced into flight, and ultimately silenced by a single arrow shot with deliberate precision. What scientists uncovered next felt almost intrusive, as if they were reading the final mundane thoughts of a man who never imagined the contents of his stomach would become forensic evidence, because Ötzi's last meal was preserved with such absurd precision that it revealed not only what he ate before dying but how he felt while eating it, transforming simple food into a timeline of fear, exhaustion, and a rapidly closing window of survival. Inside his stomach, still neatly layered like the sediment of a life interrupted, researchers found ibex meat rich in fat, red deer, spelt grains, wild herbs, traces of pollen from plants blooming in a warm valley far below the icy ridge where he died, and even charcoal fragments suggesting he had eaten something cooked over a fire, moments before panic forced him to climb. The presence of warm season pollen shocked investigators because it meant that earlier that same day, or perhaps even just hours before his death, Ötzi had been in a mild climate at lower altitude, eating calmly in a place where spring or early summer flowers budded, an environment completely different from the hostile glacial slope where he eventually fell. And yet, the meal was not just food. It was a clue, two distinct eating episodes preserved inside him like pages torn from a diary. The first showed no stress markers, no accelerated digestion, nothing suggesting fear or urgency. He had eaten like a man going about an ordinary day, unaware that violence was already shadowing his steps. But the second meal was different, metabolized under conditions of acute stress, meaning he had eaten it while his body was already shifting into fight or flight mode, suggesting that somewhere between those two meals he had been ambushed, chased, or thrown into a conflict that forced him to flee upward into treacherous alpine terrain. The visible chunks of fat and meat still in his stomach showed that he had eaten hurriedly, almost desperately, swallowing large pieces without proper chewing, perhaps trying to regain strength for a climb he knew he might not survive. It was the prehistoric equivalent of someone wolfing down food before running for their life, a detail that, while mundane, felt hauntingly human. No ritual meal, no farewell moment, no calm preparation for death, just frantic bites of ibex meat and grains, grabbed in haste before the next threat arrived. And in the charcoal flecks embedded within the food, another detail surfaced: his last meal had been cooked. Someone, perhaps even Ötzi himself, had taken the time to light a fire, prepare meat, and eat it warm, which meant he had not been wandering aimlessly or starving. He had paused, however briefly, in the middle of a dangerous situation to make himself stronger. Perhaps he believed he had escaped. Perhaps he hoped he had gained enough distance from whoever had attacked him earlier. Or perhaps the fire was a moment of denial, a fragile ritual of normalcy, performed by a man who sensed he was being hunted, but tried to pretend for a moment that he wasn't. Yet the mountain climb that followed was no leisurely ascent. It was a desperate retreat upward, away from the valley where blood had already been spilled, moving into cold, oxygen-thin heights that no person chooses unless he is either deeply confident or deeply afraid, with injuries on his hands fresh from the struggle, with a bow unfinished and arrows only half prepared, and with his body already showing signs of exhaustion. The climb itself became evidence. Ötzi had not been wandering, he had been fleeing. And every bite of food preserved inside him whispered the same truth. He was alive, aware, and still fighting for survival only moments before someone drew a bow behind him and ended his story in a single silent strike. Modern forensic analysis revealed that Ötzi did not approach his death as an unprepared wanderer caught by surprise, but as a wounded survivor who had already been through a physical confrontation intense enough to leave fresh cuts, bruises, and blood traces on his body and tools, a confrontation that likely erupted only hours before the fatal arrow struck him from behind, transforming him from a hunter into prey in the most literal sense. The first clues lay in his hands, fresh defensive wounds carved across his palms and fingers, not scars from old labor, but bright, sharp cuts, indicative of a struggle where he had grabbed a blade, blocked blows, or attempted to fight off attackers in a frantic exchange that forced him to meet violence at close range. His knuckles were swollen, the kind of swelling that forms when a fist has connected with something solid, suggesting not only that someone struck him, but that he had struck back, swinging with the desperation of a man who knew showing weakness meant death. These weren't the marks of a fall, nor the scrapes of a clumsy climb. They were the unmistakable fingerprints of combat, written into flesh that had only minutes or hours to bleed and swell before being sealed forever by the glacier. Alongside the wounds came another disturbing revelation. 4 different human blood types were found on his weapons and clothing, indicating that Ötzi had not fought a single opponent, but had been entangled in a multi-person conflict, perhaps a chaotic brawl or a sequence of confrontations that left him injured, shaken, and acutely aware that the danger was not over. His flint knife was the most damning piece of evidence. carrying microscopic traces of someone else's fresh blood near the edge and the handle, as if he had stabbed or cut someone recently, an act either defensive or preemptive, but clearly part of a violent encounter severe enough to leave marks on several individuals. His arrows showed similar signs: blood, damage, and wear that implied they had been used, retrieved, and possibly fired again in a rapid string of actions too, rushed to allow him time to replace or repair them properly. The half-finished bow became another silent witness, its incomplete shape suggesting that he had tried to fix or construct a weapon while adrenaline flooded his body, a man trying to regain some measure of control before danger returned. This paints a picture not of a calm Copper Age survivalist, but of a man thrust into a volatile situation where conflict had erupted suddenly, violently, and close enough to leave his muscles trembling and his instincts sharpened by fear. Whether he had been ambushed by rivals, entangled in a tribal dispute, or caught in the aftermath of a personal grudge is impossible to say with certainty, but the evidence makes one truth undeniable. He was already running for his life when he began climbing the high ridge where he would eventually fall. The fact that he attempted repairs on his bow during this escape, carving shafts, adjusting fletchings, and working with trembling injured hands, reveals both determination and dread, because no man sits down in the aftermath of a fight to repair his weapon unless he believes the fight is not over. Something or someone had terrified him enough that he chose the most dangerous possible route, upward into thinner air, colder winds, and steep slopes, where each step drains strength rapidly. He was choosing terrain that would punish him, but that might slow his pursuers. He wasn't wandering. He was retreating, wounded, breathless, clutching tools that were failing him, climbing into a place where no one willingly goes unless danger is closing in from below. And somewhere behind him, almost certainly watching his ascent, someone else was preparing the shot that would end his life and freeze his final heartbeat into the ice for 5,000 years. When the final moment arrived, it did not unfold as a dramatic struggle or a desperate last stand, because every piece of evidence shows that Ötzi never saw the killer, never turned to face him, never raised a weapon in defense. Instead, he was moving uphill, exhausted, injured, and focused on surviving the next few steps when a single arrow, launched with deliberate precision from behind and slightly above, tore silently through the thin alpine air and struck him with such accuracy that no prehistoric hunter could have mistaken it for anything but a kill shot intended to finish a man, not frighten or wound him. The arrow entered his back at an angle that only someone with the high ground could achieve, piercing through muscle and slipping between ribs before severing the subclavian artery near his left shoulder, a catastrophic injury that would have drained his strength almost instantly, sending his blood pressure crashing before his mind could even process the pain. For modern forensic experts, the damage was unmistakable. The killer was not guessing, not hesitant, but skilled and controlled, firing with the calm of someone who either knew Ötzi well or had practiced such shots countless times before. There was no second arrow, no evidence of a rushed follow-up, no sign of a struggle after the impact. The first shot was all that was needed. Once the flint-tipped point punched into that artery, Ötzi had only minutes, perhaps seconds, before collapse became inevitable. His lungs would have tightened, his limbs weakening as blood loss and shock overtook him, his vision narrowing as he attempted to continue climbing out of sheer instinct, despite the fatal wound already sealing his fate. And then he fell forward, not backward, not sideways, but straight ahead, as if his body simply surrendered to gravity, his arms sprawling outward in a gesture that lacked resistance or intent, the posture of someone whose life ended before his body could choose how to respond. The glacier preserved that exact fall, freezing him in the posture of his death, face down on stone and ice, tools scattered around him in positions that speak more of collapse than of any attempt to defend himself. His knife remained strapped close to him, his half-finished bow lay unusable, his arrows still bundled. Nothing had shifted into combat position, nothing suggested he even had time to turn his head. The killer did not approach him afterward. There are no signs of a finishing blow, No attempt to remove the arrowhead lodged deep inside the wound, no evidence of looting or disturbance. In fact, the most valuable thing he carried, his copper axe, was left untouched, a detail so strange and so deliberate that it transforms the killing from a practical act into something deeply personal. A thief always takes the valuable object. A murderer with a grievance leaves it behind like a verdict. Whoever fired that arrow wanted Ötzi dead, not enriched, not robbed, not humiliated, just gone. And after the arrow struck, the killer simply walked away, confident that the wound was fatal, confident that the mountain and the cold would finish what the arrow had begun, confident enough not to check the body, not to drag it, not even to disturb the snow around it. It was the prehistoric equivalent of a silent exit, a vanishing act into the landscape, leaving the victim lying exactly where he fell. Within minutes, Ötzi's life ended. The warmth left his skin, the cold gripped him, the storm swept in, and the glacier began its slow, patient work, closing over him like a vault, sealing him from the world, preserving his final moments so completely that 5,000 years later, when he was found, his death would still be visible in the position of his hands and the angle of his fall. He died without a final word, without a last gesture, without even the chance to see his killer's face. It was not a struggle. It was an execution. What followed after Ötzi collapsed was not a scene of chaos. No frantic looting, no attempts to hide the body, no signs that anyone returned to make sure he was truly dead. Instead, the aftermath of his murder was defined by an eerie, almost ceremonial silence, as if the mountains themselves swallowed the crime before the world could react, leaving the victim alone on the cold stone while everything around him continued as though nothing had happened. The most unsettling detail is that the killer never touched him again, never rolled him over, never checked his pulse, never retrieved the arrowhead buried in his shoulder, and never reached for the gleaming copper axe that lay beside him, an act so profoundly intentional that archaeologists consider it one of the most revealing clues to motive, because no man of that era would walk past such a symbol of wealth unless he feared being recognized with it, or unless the killing had nothing to do with objects at all. The axe remained where Ötzi fell, untouched for 5,000 years, waiting like a frozen accusation against the man who walked away. There were no footprints preserved, no signs of a struggle after the collapse, nothing to suggest a dramatic escape or a sudden chase. The murderer simply left the scene with the quiet certainty of someone who believed the deed was complete. The mountains sufficient accomplices, the weather ready to erase every trace. And in a way, the killer was right, because almost immediately after Ötzi died, the climate shifted just enough to change everything, sending storms across the ridge and burying the body under layers of snow that hardened year after year into ice. The Alps sealed him in a perfect tomb, a natural preservation chamber so efficient that even delicate structures like blood vessels, skin pores, and stomach contents survived intact. Meanwhile, life in Ötzi's community continued without him. Whether he was missed or mourned, whether someone searched for him or suspected foul play, whether rumors spread through his group about betrayal or ambush, none of that left any record the glacier could preserve. Perhaps his disappearance sparked conflict. Perhaps it was welcomed. Perhaps those whose blood was found on his tools limped home with their own version of the story. Humans lie, especially after violence, and the truth of that afternoon likely dissolved into competing accounts no archaeologist would ever hear. What we do know is that nobody climbed the ridge afterward to retrieve him. No friend tracked his steps, no companion braved the cold to bring back his prized possessions, and no member of his group attempted to give him a burial. Either they feared the killer, or they believed Ötzi had fled, or the mountain simply became an unspoken boundary no one dared cross again. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. He was left where he fell, surrendered to the glacier, his body slowly becoming part of the frozen landscape, while the world around him aged, changed, and eventually forgot him entirely. Season after season, the ice thickened, settling around him with the weight of centuries, preserving him more faithfully than any human could. Storms raged, Empires rose and fell, languages were born and died, and still he remained there, face down, the arrowhead locked in his flesh, the copper axe beside him, the evidence of his final struggle sealed in a grave no one intended to create. By the time modern hikers discovered him, humanity had forgotten everything about the man who once stood where the glacier now rested. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was not recorded. It was not remembered. It was silence, cold, perfect, and 5,000 years long. When Ötzi was finally lifted from the ice after 5,000 years of silence, it felt less like an archaeological discovery and more like a crime scene preserved with supernatural precision, as if the glacier had been waiting patiently for modern science to arrive with tools capable of reading every frozen clue it had guarded for millennia. Unlike other ancient remains which decay into fragments or skeletons, Ötzi emerged as a near-complete human being, a man frozen in the very posture of his death, carrying on his body every answer a prehistoric detective would have needed, answers that, in his time, no one had the means to interpret. Forensic teams approached him like investigators entering a cold case that had been paused rather than forgotten, using CT scans, DNA sequencing, microscopic analysis, radiology, and chemical profiling to pull information from tissue that should never have survived this long. The first scans revealed something extraordinary: his arteries, still intact enough to identify blockages, his organs shrunken but readable, his bones marked by stress and injury, and even the tiny tear in the artery caused by the arrow, the unmistakable signature of a lethal shot rather than an accident or ritual. His hair became a timeline of his movements, each centimeter storing chemical traces that showed where he had traveled in the weeks before his death, painting a picture of a man moving repeatedly between valleys and highlands, perhaps searching for safety, or tending to responsibilities now lost to history. His fingernails preserved stress lines, horizontal grooves known as Bowes lines, indicating periods of illness, hardship, or starvation in the months leading up to his final climb. Even the parasites in his digestive tract became witnesses, showing he lived with chronic infections that must have caused pain long before the fatal encounter ever began. Then there were the tattoos, more than 60 of them, preserved so clearly that researchers could map each mark with modern imaging technology. These tattoos did not resemble the ornamental patterns found in other ancient cultures. Instead, their placement aligned with pressure points and areas commonly associated with pain relief in acupuncture, suggesting that 5,000 years before the technique was formally recorded, Ötzi or his people may have discovered a rudimentary system for treating chronic pain. In other words, his body did not only carry evidence of violence, it carried evidence of medical knowledge far more advanced than expected for his era. The CT scans became the ultimate forensic breakthrough, revealing the arrowhead still embedded in his shoulder, its flint edges intact, its position perfectly matching the tear in the artery that ended his life. The scans also uncovered older injuries, including broken ribs and healed fractures, proving that Ötzi had endured a hard life long before the final confrontation. His DNA told an even deeper story: ancestry tied to early European farmers, markers of genetic disease, clues about his appearance, his intolerance to lactose, even his predisposition to heart problems. But the most astonishing revelation came from the blood analysis. On his tools and clothing, scientists identified traces of at least 4 different individuals' blood types, confirming a violent encounter that involved multiple people, something no prehistoric skeleton had ever revealed. It was the biological equivalent of finding fingerprints at a crime scene, preserved not by intention but by the miraculous conditions of the glacier. Piece by piece, detail by detail, the glacier revealed everything. His injuries, his struggles, his meals, his movements, his genetics, his final breath. The ice had done what no ancient lawman could have achieved. It had frozen a moment of violence so completely that 5 millennia later, modern science could reconstruct the entire chain of events leading to his death with a clarity that borders on unsettling. It was forensic work without precedent, a cold case so perfectly preserved that even the silence around him felt like evidence waiting to be read. Even with all the evidence preserved by the glacier, every wound, every tool, every trace of blood, every step he took in his final hours, one question refused to settle, because long after the arrow had been identified and the injuries reconstructed, the mystery that haunted archaeologists was not how Ötzi died but why, and this question, unlike the others, could not be answered by CT scans or chemical analysis, leaving researchers to piece together motive the same way detectives do when the culprit has vanished beyond reach. One of the earliest and most conservative theories proposed that Ötzi had been caught in a tribal conflict, an ordinary man drawn into disputes between neighboring groups, where boundaries were unclear, resources were precious, and violence could erupt as quickly as weather in the highlands. Under this view, he was not targeted personally. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a casualty of territorial pressure that forced someone to release an arrow rather than negotiate. Yet this explanation falters when placed alongside the personal detail of the untouched copper axe, the kind of weapon raiders would have taken instantly, and the fact that only a single perfectly placed arrow was fired. This did not feel random. A second theory suggests a territorial dispute on a smaller scale, perhaps between individuals rather than tribes. The Copper Age was a world where land, water sources, hunting zones, and seasonal routes carried enormous value, and a man who strayed into someone else's domain could easily become a target. But even this idea struggles to explain the precision and restraint shown by the killer, because territorial killings tend to be brutal, chaotic, rushed, and often followed by the removal of useful tools. Here nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed. A third theory, the leadership theory, paints a more dramatic picture. Ötzi may have been a leader or a figure of authority, someone whose copper axe signaled status, and whose influence might have threatened someone within his own community. Under this interpretation, his death could have been a political assassination, the Copper Age equivalent of removing a rival quietly and effectively. The precision of the shot, the lack of looting, and the decision to leave the axe all support this interpretation. A usurper rarely wants to be seen wielding the symbol of the man he just removed. Then there is the revenge theory. Arguably the most human and emotionally charged, 4 different blood types on his gear strongly imply that Ötzi had injured or fought multiple individuals shortly before fleeing uphill. Perhaps he wounded someone, or perhaps he killed someone during that earlier struggle, forcing the victim's companions to follow him into the mountains for a final reckoning. If this were true, the arrow that struck him was not an ambush from opportunistic strangers, but the culmination of a feud, a final exchange in a chain of violence that spiraled beyond negotiation. Yet the theory that resonates most deeply among researchers, the one that feels almost painfully human, is the personal drama theory. This theory does not depend on tribal politics or territorial maps or leadership hierarchies. It depends on human emotion, jealousy, betrayal, resentment, rivalry. The idea is simple and timeless. Ötzi may have been killed by someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to share a cooked meal with earlier that same day. The pollen and charcoal traces in his stomach show he had not been isolated before fleeing. He had eaten beside a fire, possibly with companions, possibly even with his eventual murderer. To imagine 2 men sharing food and then parting ways, one climbing into danger, the other circling behind with a bow, is unsettling in a way far deeper than tribal warfare. It transforms the killing from an act of necessity into an act of betrayal, the oldest motive in human history. And perhaps that is why modern experts cannot agree on a single explanation. All theories remain possible, because human behavior has never been neat, predictable, or logical. The world Ötzi lived in was not a simplified prehistory, but a tangle of alliances, tensions, survival pressures, and personal conflicts no different from the ones that shape us now. In the end, the motive behind his death remains the only part of the story the glacier could not preserve. It melted away with the killer, left unspoken, unrecorded, and forever beyond forensic reach. But every clue preserved in the ice, every cut, every tool, every fragment of blood, whispers the same truth. Someone wanted him gone, not robbed, not wounded, not frightened, but erased from the world. The reason Ötzi's story endures long after every person who ever knew him has turned to dust is that his death did not simply freeze a single life in time. It froze an entire world, a moment in human history, so complete that it bridges 5,000 years with an intimacy no written chronicle could ever match, revealing that the people of the Copper Age were not distant abstractions, but living, thinking, struggling humans whose fears, conflicts, and desires were not so different from our own. Before Ötzi, prehistory was largely a fog. Fragments of pottery, scattered tools, burial pits stripped of context, hints of civilizations whose voices had long faded into silence. But his body shattered that silence, offering a fully realized human being complete with clothing, tools, medical practices, food preferences, scars, illnesses, and the unmistakable evidence of a violent death. He forced historians to abandon the comforting illusion that early Europeans lived in peaceful, simple communities, untouched by the complexity and brutality of later eras, because the wounds on his hands, the blood on his tools, and the arrow in his back proved that conflict, betrayal, and structured violence were present long before written history began. More than that, Ötzi revealed that early societies were far more advanced than we once believed. His tattoos implied a rudimentary but intentional understanding of pain management. His medicinal fungi indicated knowledge of antibacterial treatment. His shoes and clothing displayed engineering, designed for harsh mountain environments. And his copper axe represented metallurgical skill far ahead of what most textbooks had credited to his time. He shifted our understanding of human innovation, showing that knowledge grows in every era, even the ones that leave no written trace. But perhaps the most profound reason his story matters is the emotional resonance it carries across millennia, because standing before Ötzi's preserved body, one does not see a symbol or a relic or a curiosity. One sees a person frozen, at the very moment when life left him, a man who fought, fled, ate, repaired tools, feared, and ultimately faced betrayal or violence, just as humans still do. His posture in death is hauntingly ordinary, arms extended, face down, caught mid-motion, reminding us that mortality has always been abrupt, indifferent, and deeply personal. He matters because he restores humanity to a time we often dismiss as distant and primitive. He matters because he proves that the past was not a blank page but a crowded landscape filled with individual stories we will never fully recover. And he matters because his survival in the ice allows us to witness with unsettling clarity the continuity of the human experience, our vulnerabilities, our ingenuity, our conflicts, and our capacity to leave traces of ourselves long after memory fades. In the end, Ötzi's story transcends archaeology or forensics. It becomes a reminder that history is not made only by kings, generals, and monuments, but also by ordinary people whose lives are rarely recorded yet shape the fabric of humanity all the same. His death, tragic and undeserved, became his voice, carrying across 5,000 years to tell us who he was, how he lived, and how deeply and violently human his final hours were. When all the evidence is laid out, the arrow wound, the defensive cuts, the unfinished bow, the blood of multiple individuals, the last meal eaten in panic, the climb into unforgiving heights, the untouched copper axe, the silent collapse, and the glacier's perfect preservation, the story of Ötzi becomes less a mystery and more a fully reconstructed sequence of events, a prehistoric crime so sharply captured that modern forensic teams can retrace it with the clarity of a case only days old, proving that even the oldest cold case in human history can be solved when time itself becomes the witness. The sequence begins in the valley where Ötzi ate his first calm meal, unaware that conflict loomed so close behind him, and where a violent encounter soon erupted, one severe enough to leave fresh wounds on his hands, blood on his knife, and traces of multiple people's injuries on his gear. From there he fled, wounded and shaken, pausing only long enough to eat again and repair his bow, two small acts of survival that reveal both his fear and his determination to prepare for a second confrontation he clearly believed was coming. Then came the climb, the desperate ascent into a landscape so harsh that no one chooses it unless hunted, followed by the fatal moment when someone tracking him from below seized the advantage of higher ground, drew back a bowstring, and released an arrow with precision enough to strike a vital artery on the first attempt. The shot ended the struggle instantly. The fall that followed froze the moment forever. The killer, whoever he was, friend, rival, tribesman or stranger, left the scene without touching the body, without taking the prized copper axe, and without attempting to alter or hide anything. A decision that reveals a cold confidence in the lethality of the strike, and perhaps a belief that no one would ever discover the truth. And indeed, for 5,000 years, no one did. The glacier sealed the crime like a vault, preserving Ötzi in a posture of silent testimony, while the world above him changed beyond recognition. But when his body finally emerged from the melting ice, modern forensics opened the case that prehistory had tried to store away, reading every wound, every cell, every microscopic trace left on his tools, reconstructing his ancestry, his diet, his illnesses, his tattoos, his final days, and ultimately his murder with a precision so extraordinary that even the killer, had he lived to see it, would not believe how completely his crime was uncovered. Ötzi did not choose to become the most thoroughly investigated human being in history, nor did he seek the strange immortality that awaited him in museums and laboratories. He simply died in a place where the cold refused to let him go, where time could not erase his final moments, and where a crime meant to vanish into snow and silence, instead survived long enough for the modern world to resurrect it. In solving this ancient case, scientists did more than identify a murder. They connected us to a man who lived, fought, ran, feared, and died in a world that left almost no written memory of itself. They closed a case older than every civilization still standing today, proving that even the deepest past can speak if the evidence survives. Ötzi became the frozen witness to his own story, and 5,000 years later, the world finally listened. As researchers continued to study Ötzi year after year, they began to realize that his discovery was not just a remarkable archaeological find, but a turning point for modern science itself, because every fragment of his body, every fiber of his clothing, every tool he carried forced experts to expand the limits of their disciplines, merging archaeology, forensic pathology, anthropology, genetics, climatology, and even medical research into a single unprecedented investigation that reshaped how we understand the ancient world and our own origins. His DNA, sequenced with painstaking precision, became one of the oldest full genetic profiles ever decoded, revealing not only his ancestry, but also markers of disease still present in modern humans, such as a predisposition to heart disease, intolerance to lactose, and even genetic traces of Lyme disease, an illness no one expected to identify in a 5,000-year-old body. This genetic window allowed scientists to trace migrations, family lineages, and biological adaptations stretching back to the earliest European populations, turning Ötzi from a victim on a mountain into a central figure in the story of human evolution on the continent. His clothing ignited a revolution in textile archaeology, proving that prehistoric Europeans possessed skills far more advanced than previously imagined. His leggings resembled tailored garments rather than crude wrappings. His fur-lined shoes displayed a layered engineering method nearly identical to modern insulated footwear, and the meticulous stitching on his coat demonstrated a level of craftsmanship that suggested tradition, technique, and cultural knowledge passed through generations. Each thread and seam forced historians to reconsider how people dressed, survived, and traveled in climates far harsher than those faced by most populations today. Even his tattoos, once dismissed as primitive or symbolic, gained new significance when researchers discovered their placement corresponded to acupuncture points, revealing that therapeutic body marking existed thousands of years before written records describe it. This single discovery sent ripples through the medical community, challenging assumptions about the history of pain management and suggesting that prehistoric societies possessed a deeper intuitive understanding of the human body than anyone had imagined. But the most profound transformation occurred in forensic science, because Ötzi became the ultimate test subject, a 5,000-year-old body on which modern methods could be tested, refined and expanded without ethical restrictions typically imposed on contemporary cases. Every scan, every biopsy, every microscopic examination approached the boundary between respectful study and invasive analysis, forcing scientists and ethicists to debate where the line should be drawn when dealing with someone who cannot consent, someone whose remains have become both scientific treasure and human story. Museums faced their own dilemmas. Was it respectful to display a man who died in fear and violence, exposing his body to millions of eyes? Did preservation honor his memory or exploit it? Some argued that he deserved burial, while others insisted that the knowledge gained from studying him was too valuable to relinquish to the soil. In the end, he remained in a carefully controlled environment, preserved as meticulously as the glacier once preserved him, waiting for each new generation of researchers to ask questions never imagined before his discovery. Ötzi became a paradox, a man from a forgotten world who in death influenced every major scientific field that touched his remains. Through him we learned how ancient humans traveled, fought, survived, healed, clothed themselves, suffered from disease, treated pain, and navigated harsh landscapes. He forced us to confront how little we truly knew about early European societies, and how fragile historical assumptions become when confronted with perfectly preserved evidence. And as technology advances, there is no doubt that Ötzi will continue to speak, revealing new secrets long after the tools that first studied him have become outdated relics themselves. His body, frozen in a single tragic moment, will remain one of humanity's rarest links to its own distant past. As the decades passed and Ötzi's fame grew, a difficult and uncomfortable question began rising to the surface. A question that hovered over every scientific breakthrough, every documentary, every museum display, and every researcher who laid a gloved hand upon the ancient skin of the Iceman, who, if anyone, has the right to claim ownership over a man who died 5,000 years ago. This dilemma was not simply legal or scientific, but deeply human, forcing modern society to examine how we treat the dead, what we owe to the past, and whether knowledge and curiosity can ever override dignity. When Ötzi was first removed from the ice in 1991, the issue seemed straightforward. He was an archaeological discovery found in the Alps, and the nearest modern borders determined his custody. But as nations negotiated jurisdiction, Austria and Italy debated territorial lines with the seriousness usually reserved for political disputes. And once the arguments settled and the corpse was placed in an Italian museum, the legal boundaries faded and a larger question took shape, because Ötzi was no longer viewed as property but as a person whose silent presence demanded respect. Museums faced unprecedented challenges as they considered how to present him. Some believed he should remain behind closed doors, hidden from public display, preserved only for scientific study. Others insisted that his body, preserved by nature for millennia, held value for the entire world and should be accessible to the public, a bridge between modern humanity and its distant ancestors. Each perspective carried weight. Displaying him offered education, connection, and an almost spiritual encounter with prehistory, yet it also risked turning his tragic death into spectacle, reducing a human life to a macabre exhibit. Scientists, too, walked a moral tightrope. For every incision and scan and chemical analysis, They asked themselves whether they were honoring Ötzi or using him. He did not choose to become a subject of unlimited research, nor could he object to the invasive procedures that stripped layers from his body in the name of knowledge. Some argued that his preservation was so extraordinary it practically demanded exploration. Nature itself had sealed him like a message for the future. Others countered that once science had gleaned the essential facts, continued study verged on violation, probing a man who had no voice left to defend his privacy or his remain. Question after question emerged. Could his body ever be reburied? Would burial erase future scientific discoveries? Did his descendants, who might still exist somewhere generations removed, hold any rights over his remains? Was he an ancestor belonging to humanity as a whole, or a victim who deserved rest after a violent end? No consensus ever formed, only a widening circle of debate as new scientific methods appeared, each decade tempting researchers to reopen the case again and again. Yet perhaps the most haunting dilemma comes from a simple truth. Ötzi did not expect to be found. He climbed that mountain carrying fears, hopes, and tools, meant for a world that no longer exists. And when the fatal arrow struck and the ice claimed his body, the last thing he might have wished was to become the most studied human in history. And still, across museum glass, through scientific journals and in the minds of millions who hear his story, his life continues to echo. Every ethical question surrounding the Iceman circles back to one unresolved truth. Preserving him preserves us, our history, our mistakes, and our origins, even as it asks us to confront what it means to handle the past with both curiosity and humility. What makes Ötzi extraordinary is not simply the mystery of his murder or the impossible preservation of his body, but the way his presence forced the modern world to rewrite entire chapters of human history, dismantling long-held assumptions and replacing them with evidence so detailed that prehistory suddenly felt shockingly close, almost familiar, as if the Copper Age world had reached across 5 millennia to tap us on the shoulder and say, "You misunderstood us. Here is how we really lived." Before Ötzi, prehistoric Europe was painted in broad strokes: small farming communities, simple tools, short, hard lives, vague social structures, and very limited medical knowledge. Much of what we believed came from shattered pottery, scattered bones, or tools so worn by soil and time that their stories had faded. But then, a single man emerged from the ice, untouched, unrotted, unblurred by time. And suddenly the Copper Age was no longer a foggy outline. It had a face, a pulse, a wardrobe, a diet, a medical history, and a violent final chapter. He showed us that prehistoric people were not primitive caricatures, but complex, resourceful, emotionally driven humans capable of craftsmanship, long-distance travel, healing traditions, tactical thinking, and interpersonal conflict. His clothes alone rewrote history, multi-layered, insulated, carefully stitched pieces made from goat, sheep, deer, and bear, the world's first technical mountain gear, crafted not by accident but by knowledge passed through generations. His shoes prove that ancient people understood arch support, moisture control, and insulation better than some modern outdoor brands. His tattoos revealed therapeutic techniques long before written medical systems took shape, evidence that even without formal science, early humans identified patterns of pain and invented ways to treat it. And then came his tools. The copper axe, polished, valuable, unmistakably a status symbol, told us that metallurgy had advanced more than archaeologists had imagined. His unfinished bow and multi-type arrows revealed a meticulous approach to hunting and fighting. His medicine kit showed that prehistoric people understood anti-inflammatory fungi and antiseptic materials, meaning their healing knowledge was not random but empirical and practiced. Even his stomach contents changed archaeology. For the first time, scientists could see, not imagine, not infer, but see what a prehistoric meal looked like. Ibex fat, red deer, grains, herbs, traces of charcoal from a fire. This level of dietary detail had never been preserved in any other ancient human, and it shattered the assumption that prehistoric meals were crude or monotone. Instead, they were varied, intentional, and nutritionally balanced, shaped by environment, season, and experience. His murder, violent, calculated, and personal, proved that prehistoric life was not the peaceful pastoral world some scholars once romanticized. People held grudges, formed alliances, betrayed each other, fought over land, resources, pride, or perhaps something as simple and universal as anger. Humanity has always been complicated. But perhaps Ötzi's greatest legacy is emotional. He transformed distant prehistory into something human, relatable, and painfully real. His fear during his final climb, his desperate repair of his bow, his last meals swallowed under stress, all of it reminded us that the people who lived 5,000 years ago were not faceless shadows in textbooks. They were us. They felt pain, love, hunger, exhaustion, hope, and fear in ways that transcend time. Ötzi made the past human again, and in doing so, he became not just an archaeological discovery, but a bridge connecting the living with the dead, the present with the forgotten, and the fragile story of one murdered man with the vast tangled history of our species. For all the scans, tests, reconstructions, and decades of scrutiny, a strange truth hangs over Ötzi's story like the cold breath of the glacier that kept him, even with the world's most advanced science. Several pieces of his life still sit just beyond our reach, small unanswered riddles that whisper from the edges of the case and remind us that some parts of prehistory guard their secrets with stubborn ancient pride. We don't know who killed him. Not truly. We know the trajectory, the weapon, the angle, the violence of the strike, and the precision of the shot. But the identity of the murderer evaporated 5,000 years ago. Was it a member of his own group, pushed by anger or betrayal? Was it someone from a rival community whose grudge stretched across valleys and seasons? Or was it a former ally who simply made a choice that history forgot to record? The arrow tells us how, but the silence of the mountains tells us nothing about who. We still don't know why the confrontation began. The 4 different blood types on his gear hint at chaos. A fight that spiraled, a series of clashes stacked on top of each other. But they refuse to clarify the spark. Was it a dispute over territory? A revenge cycle? A broken pact? A moment of personal anger? Or something far smaller? The kind of trivial conflict that snowballs into tragedy long before anyone realizes it. Human motives are messy even today. In the Copper Age, with no witnesses and no written records, they dissolve entirely. We don't know who he traveled with during his final day. The pollen in his stomach proves he moved through warm valleys before ascending the icy slopes, which almost certainly means he wasn't alone at first. Yet everyone who might have walked beside him vanished from the record the moment he died. Did they flee? Did they fall? Were they involved? Did they betray him, or try to save him? The glacier preserved Ötzi but erased everyone else. We don't know his real name. We call him Ötzi, a nickname borrowed from the Ötzi Alps where he died. But the name he carried in life, the one spoken by his family, his tribe, his enemies, his friends, was lost before the first pyramids rose in Egypt. Whatever he was called, whatever titles or jokes or curses were attached to him, they faded long before the ice sealed him. We don't know what role he played in his community. His copper axe suggests authority. His tattoos suggest chronic pain. His well-crafted gear suggests experience. His injuries suggest conflict. And his movements in his final hours suggest he was hunted. But was he a leader, a healer, a hunter, a scout, a troublemaker, a respected elder, a man with enemies, or perhaps a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Every interpretation fits, and none can be confirmed. We don't know his emotional life. No scan can reveal the way he laughed, the people he loved, the fears that shaped him, the rivalries that followed him, or the losses he carried through the mountains. Science can measure the stress in his final meals, but not the thoughts that raced through his mind as he climbed higher, wounded and exhausted. trying to outrun whoever hunted him. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all, we don't know what happened in the minutes between the moment he felt the arrow strike and the moment he collapsed. Did he realize he was dying? Did he try to turn? Did he attempt to stand? Did he whisper something to the sky? Or was the death so fast, so final, that he never understood what hit him? The ice froze him mid-fall, but not the thoughts inside his skull. Even after decades of research, Ötzi remains a fusion of knowledge and silence, a man half revealed and half hidden behind the eternal frost. His body answered questions no one ever expected science could solve, yet it left behind just enough uncertainty to remind us that the past is not a puzzle meant to be fully completed. Some pieces stay missing, some stories remain unfinished, some mysteries refuse to bow to time. And perhaps that is why the world still cares. Because as long as questions linger, Ötzi the Iceman is not just a corpse in a museum. He is a story still alive, still unfolding, still inviting us to wonder what it truly meant to live and die in a world so distant, yet so achingly human. Long before nations rose and fell, before empires carved borders into the earth, before iron replaced copper and written history replaced memory, a single man collapsed on a windswept glacier and disappeared into the ice. He expected nothing from the future. No remembrance, no legacy, no audience. His life ended as millions of others did in the prehistoric world, quietly, painfully, anonymously. Yet the ice did something extraordinary. It refused to let him vanish. In death, Ötzi became immortal. His survival was accidental, a perfect collision of altitude, weather, temperature, and geological luck. Had he died 10 meters lower, rain and rot would have erased him before his bones cooled. Had he died 10 meters higher, scavengers would have scattered him across the rocks. Had a landslide, a warm season, or even the wrong angle of sunlight touched him, he would have melted into the soil of history like thousands of others. But instead, the glacier closed around him like a sealed time capsule, preserving not only his body, but the world he carried with him. His tools, his meals, his injuries, his fears, his final decisions. He was frozen not just in posture but in narrative. A man paused in the middle of his last breath and presented to the future as if time itself wanted him remembered. When the ice finally released him 5,000 years later, Ötzi rewrote what immortality meant. His influence spread across museums, classrooms, documentaries, and scientific fields that did not exist when he lived. He became a case study for forensic science, a teaching tool for archaeology, a symbol of prehistoric life, and an ambassador from a world older than language. He connected continents, inspired art, fueled debates, reshaped theories, and fascinated millions who looked at his leathery skin and felt an unexpected sense of kinship. For in Ötzi, people saw not just a corpse but a mirror, proof that even the earliest humans were not distant or alien but familiar. A man who stitched clothing with care, who carried medicines to ease pain, who prepared for danger, who trusted and was betrayed, who fought and fled, who ate, worked, feared, hoped, and finally met a violent end in a moment of panic and exhaustion. He was not a symbol or a stereotype. He was a person. His immortality comes not from myth or legend, but from truth, because truth lasts longer than stories. And Ötzi's truth is carved into every detail preserved by the ice. The angle of an arrow, the scars of past injuries, the microscopic pollen in his stomach, the fingerprints of conflicts we can still trace in the blood on his blade. Every scientific advancement brings him back to life a little more. His face reconstructed, his voice approximated, his ancestry mapped, his habits understood. 5,000 years after he died, he continues to speak through data, offering clues piece by piece, refusing to fade. And this may be his most profound form of immortality. Ötzi did not change the world through conquest, invention, or philosophy. He changed it simply by being found. His story endures because it reveals the fragility of life and the stubbornness of memory, the determinism of nature and the unpredictability of fate. It reminds us that every human being, no matter how ordinary, carries a universe of detail within them, details that matter, that define, that echo. Ötzi was one man among countless millions, yet he is the one whose life stands before us intact, not because he sought greatness, but because the ice chose to remember him when time would have preferred to forget. And as long as scientists study him, as long as visitors stare at the glass that surrounds him, as long as his mystery inspires curiosity, Ötzi remains alive, not in body, but in legacy, in knowledge, in the relentless fascination of a world trying to understand its own beginnings. He climbed a mountain to escape death. Instead, he found a kind of immortality no human before him ever received. When you step back from the forensic details, the stomach contents, the weapons, the wounds, the tattoos, and the carefully reconstructed final hours, something unexpected begins to surface. Something far more profound than the cold facts of a murder, half a world and 5 millennia removed from us. You begin to see that Ötzi the Iceman, this solitary figure sealed in ancient frost, is not really a story about prehistory at all. It is a story about us. Because in Ötzi's preserved life, his gear, his instincts, his fears, his small comforts, we discover the clearest lesson the past can give. Human beings have always been human. We find that the emotions he carried into those mountains are the same ones we carry today. The need to belong to a group, the fear of being hunted or betrayed, the desire to survive and protect what matters, the ache of chronic pain, the resourcefulness born of necessity, the quiet comfort of a warm meal before a long journey, the frustration of unfinished tasks, the sudden, disorienting panic of conflict, the stubborn hope that climbing a little higher might keep danger away. His final hours capture the entire spectrum of the human condition in a single desperate ascent: exhaustion, determination, confusion, hunger, injury, instinct, and ultimately the acceptance, however brief, that his body could not push any further. And in that acceptance we see the raw vulnerability that defines every human life, ancient or modern. Because when the arrow struck him, when the cold pressed in around him, when his strength bled out onto the stone, the boundary between us and him vanished. 5,000 years collapsed in an instant. His fear could have been our fear. His breath could have been our breath. His stumble could have been our final step. Ötzi reminds us that history is not a distant, orderly march of empires and inventions. History is personal. It is made of ordinary people living ordinary days interrupted by extraordinary events. People who struggled, endured, failed, feared, loved, survived, and sometimes met death in ways that still echo centuries later. He reminds us that every anonymous life carries a universe of detail, that behind every artifact, every tool, every piece of clothing, every scar, there is a story so complex and so human that it could fill volumes. Ötzi's preserved body is proof that no one is just a caveman, just a prehistoric figure, just a missing link. Each person, regardless of era, holds their own world. He teaches us humility, because his survival into our age was pure chance, a reminder that the past is not gone but simply hidden beneath layers we have not yet uncovered. He teaches us fragility, because his death, swift, brutal, final, shows how quickly life can change, how little separates survival from tragedy. He teaches us connection, because his story binds our present to a distant past, showing that the timeline of humanity is not a sequence of disconnected ages, but a single continuous thread. And above all, he teaches us that memory is unpredictable, that immortality can come to anyone, not through fame or glory, but through circumstance, curiosity, and the relentless desire of future generations to understand where they came from. Ötzi the Iceman did not build a monument. He did not write a text. He did not carve his name into stone. And yet, by simply existing, by living and dying in a world that has long since vanished, he became one of the most enduring figures in human history. A man frozen in time, teaching the living what it means to be human.